everyone, welcome back to another video, or welcome if you are new to my channel. Happy 2026. I hope you all had a lovely festive period and brought in the new year in the way that you wanted to. There's a lot of expectations, I feel like, for a new year, but actually I don't think that's warranted, because for us in the northern hemisphere at least, it's the middle of winter still, so it's not really a time for starting new things. In my opinion, I feel like spring is technically the beginning of a new year, so please don't feel pressured to have to change anything. You know, we're still in hibernation mode, and even if you are in the southern hemisphere and are in summer, don't feel pressured either. You know, take life at your own pace. That's what I say. So you may have noticed that I'm in a different setup. That's because I haven't had a chance to put my setup back in the corner of the living room that I usually film in, and also my neighbours have got guests over and they're playing games and having fun, so they're making a fair bit of noise, and our living rooms are back to back, so I can hear them through the wall. And I have come and sat literally on my landing. This is probably the quietest part of my house because I can shut all the doors, and I'm hoping there'll be less disturbance in this little corner of my landing. I'm also having to hold my microphone, which I've never done before, so I hope that I'm holding it at the right distance and it's not too invasive. So, and there's no like popping. I'm really sorry if there is. I'll try my best to edit anything out that sounds terrible. So I've got my mic in one hand and then my Kindle in the other with my script on it, so this is going to be interesting. So I'm back with another true crime video, and I thought I would start off the new year with a crime that unfortunately took place on New Year's Day of 2006. So let's just dive right into this story. On January 1st, 2006, firefighters in Woodland Heights, Virginia, were dispatched to a house fire at 812 West 31st Street. As emergency vehicles sped through the neighborhood, they passed large, elegant homes, still glowing with Christmas lights and holiday decorations. It was a beautiful area that this family lived in. Everything still looked festive and peaceful until they reached their destination. The two-story home was completely engulfed in flames. Firefighters rushed inside, hoping against all odds that someone might still be alive. But almost immediately, they realized this wasn't just a tragic accident. This was a crime scene. The home belonged to Brian and Catherine Harvey, and they were a well-known couple in the Richmond area. Brian was a respected musician, best known for being one half of the 1980s alternative rock band House of Freaks. Even after the band broke up, he continued making music well into the mid-2000s, collaborating with other artists and releasing albums while building a life with his wife. Brian and Catherine's love story was often described as something out of a romantic movie. Catherine was creative, artistic, and ambitious. She had been homecoming queen and later moved to Richmond to pursue an art degree at Virginia Commonwealth University. Like many college students, she worked relentlessly to support herself. She painted sets for community theatre, waited tables, and worked as a pastry chef. Art wasn't just her passion, it was her identity. Brian, on the other hand, he embodied the classic rock and roll lifestyle. shift from the darker, more political tones that House of Freaks were known for. And the lyrics were hopeful and joyful, reflecting the life that Brian was building for himself. When the band officially split in 1995, Brian was okay with it because by this point his focus had shifted to something far more important. Him and Catherine had their first daughter, Stella. Brian openly wrote about how fatherhood gave his life meaning, saying he finally understood why he was on this earth. 5 years later, in 2001, they welcomed their second daughter, Ruby. Brian continued playing music, but it was now just a passion rather than his career, because he now worked in IT for local schools, providing stability for his family. Meanwhile, Catherine had opened her own business, a novelty toy store called World of Mirth that actually still exists in Richmond today. From the outside, the Harveys were living the American dream. They had meaningful work, creativity, a beautiful home in a wealthy neighbourhood, and 2 young daughters. On New Year's Eve 2005, Brian performed a show in the local area and returned home around 2 a.m. absolutely exhausted. And the next day would be busy because the family was hosting a New Year's Day party in the afternoon, which was like a tradition of theirs. So they planned to spend the morning cleaning, decorating, prepping food, but at around 1:30 p.m, Brian's friend Johnny, who was also his bandmate, headed over to their house early. The Harveys were known to have an open door policy. All their friends were welcome anytime with no invitation. You could just turn up and they would be happy to have you if they were at home. But when Johnny arrived, he didn't find party preparations. He found the house on fire. He immediately called 911, and other neighbours had rushed outside to see what was happening at the house, and something felt very wrong because no one had fled the house. Brian, Catherine, Stella and Ruby were nowhere to be seen, so people assumed the worst, that they were still inside. When firefighters arrived, they entered the home with almost zero visibility because there was so much smoke and the heat was very intense. They could barely see their hands in front of them. The fire seemed to be coming from the basement, which is where the family were setting up preparations for the party because they had a living area down there. One rescuer descended the stairs into the basement and collided with a body. It was Catherine. She was unconscious and unresponsive. He carried her outside and began CPR, then noticed something horrifying. A sock had been forced into her mouth, and her ankles and hands were bound up. Moments later, another firefighter found a child near the staircase, 4-year-old Ruby. She was also bound. Both Catherine and Ruby were pronounced dead at the scene, and the police were immediately called. Once the fire was extinguished, investigators searched for Brian and 9-year-old Stella. Inside the home, they had found 2 blood-stained hammers lying in plain view, along with wine bottles that seemed to be what started the fire. Brian was found face down and hog-tied, and Stella's body was discovered under a futon. It seems as if she may have been alive when the fire was started and she was hiding under this futon in terror. Autopsies revealed that all 4 victims had been brutally attacked before the fire happened. They'd suffered multiple stab wounds, blunt force trauma, and injuries described by a city attorney as torture. especially severe. Brian and Catherine's wedding rings were missing, and friends insisted that they never removed them, pointing to the tan lines on their fingers where the rings were always sat. Police initially believed that this was a robbery gone wrong. The Harveys rarely locked their doors, which meant that anyone could have walked in without forcing entry. As detectives investigated, they briefly took a closer look at his friend Johnny Hott, not because of evidence, but because of a disturbing coincidence. Years earlier, the band House of Freaks had released a song titled Hey 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 Hey. After the murders, investigators revisited the lyrics of this song, and what they found was quite chilling. The song describes a woman being attacked in a basement. One verse goes, "Heartbroken woman, hey hey, hey hey, in the basement, hey hey, hey hey, begs him for mercy." Immediately after this verse, there's a sound effect mimicking a knife being picked up, implying that the woman in the song is about to be stabbed. Later on, another verse describes the killer's escape, saying, "Goes through the screen door, hey hey, hey hey, climbs out the window, hey hey, hey hey." So the parallels between the lyrics in this song and what they've just discovered at this family's home was unsettling. The Harveys were in the basement, their screen door was often unlocked, and the crime involved stabbing. But despite these eerie similarities, Johnny was questioned multiple times and remained consistent. He explained that Brian had written that song, not him, years before the murders happened, and it was purely fictional. With no evidence tying him to the crime, Johnny was officially cleared. But the coincidence remains one of the most disturbing details of this case. It's very confusing and odd that such a coincidence like this happens, but it does seem like, as you'll find out later on, that it is just a coincidence. The investigation took a major turn when Kirsten Perkinson told police that she had dropped Stella off at the house at around 10 a.m. that morning, where she said Catherine appeared pale and distressed, and she wasn't warm and welcoming like she usually is when friends turn up at their house. She seemed very off and not herself. When Kirsten's daughter tried to follow Stella down into the basement, Catherine stopped her. And before Kirsten left, Catherine made a small but haunting gesture. She circled her finger near her temple. Something like this, I think, that may have been signalling danger, but Kirsten was just perplexed at the time as to her behaviour, so she didn't really know what to make of it. 5 days after the Harvey family was murdered, Richmond police received another disturbing call, this one from a woman named Latoya Pawley. Latoya was frantic. She hadn't heard from her friend, 21-year-old Ashley Baskerville, in over a day, which she said was extremely unusual. Ashley had recently been spending time with 2 men who made Latoya deeply uncomfortable. She told police that she did not trust them and that something felt off about them, and she mentioned that Ashley had been getting bad vibes from them as well. When Ashley stopped answering calls entirely, Latoya's concern turned into fear. She gave the police Ashley's address and asked them to perform a welfare check. When officers arrived, what they found was horrifying. Inside the home were 3 bodies: Ashley Baskerville, her mother Mary, and her stepfather Purcell. All 3 of them had their hands and ankles bound up, secured with duct tape and miscellaneous cords. And Purcell had socks shoved into his mouth like a gag. He had been stabbed 5 times in the neck, and Mary had been stabbed twice. scratches in the neck. Unlike the Harveys, all 3 victims had also been suffocated using duct tape, plastic wrap, and a plastic shopping bag. The similarities between the 2 crime scenes was undeniable. Both households had victims who were bound, gagged, stabbed in the neck, and brutally murdered. The murders occurred in the same city, less than a week apart, so police were now thinking that they had a serial killing spree on their hands. What investigators didn't understand yet was how these 2 families were connected. The Harveys were artistic, eccentric, deeply involved in music and creativity, and Mary and Purcell were older and very religious. They were heavily involved in their local church, so on the surface it seemed that these families had nothing in common. Detectives went back to LaToya Pauly, and this time she told them everything. She explained that she and Ashley had been friends since high school. Ashley had always struggled at home, clashing constantly with her strict, traditional parents, and by 2006 she was estranged from them. Instead, Ashley had gravitated towards 2 men, Ricky Gray and his nephew, Ray Dandridge. On January 6, 2006, Ashley introduced LaToya to Ricky and Ray. While the group were hanging out, the men complained about needing money. Ashley then mentioned that her stepfather kept cash in the house. She openly admitted that she didn't get along with him, and she said she would not care if he got robbed. This conversation then escalated into a plan. Ashley, Ricky, and Ray decided that they would stage a fake kidnapping. Ricky and Ray would pretend to abduct Ashley and demand ransom money from her parents. Once the money was paid, Ashley would be returned safely and they would split the cash. Ashley's parents, already terrified by the Harvey murders dominating the local news, would have no reason to suspect it was fake. LaToya immediately knew this was a terrible idea and refused to participate. She left, telling them that she would catch up with them later. Hours passed, then Ricky and Ray returned, but Ashley was gone. When LaToya asked where her friend was, one of the men casually told her that Ashley had gone bye-bye. They explained without emotion that Ashley had demanded too large a share of the ransom money. The implication was clear: they had killed her. LaToya was horrified. As soon as she was safe, she called the police and triggered the welfare check that uncovered the second crime scene. As detectives dug deeper, Ricky and Ray's violent history came into focus. Ricky had endured severe abuse as a child, both physical and sexual, at the hands of his father and half-brother. By adulthood, he had an extensive criminal record, including armed robberies. Ray, despite being Ricky's nephew, was the same age and more like a peer. Both men spent years cycling in and out of prison. In 2005, Ricky married a woman named Trevor. Within months, she planned to leave him, and then Trevor disappeared. 5 days later, her body was found under a tree near a used car lot. She had been beaten with a pipe and strangled. Ricky had visible scratches on his arms the day that she vanished. Police strongly suspected him, but lacked any evidence. Shortly after this, Ricky and Ray moved to Virginia, and that is when these killings began. Investigators also learned that around the time of the Harvey murders, Ricky and Ray were staying with LaToya and her mother. While watching news coverage of the Harvey case, LaToya recognized a stolen laptop shown on television. It was one that she had seen Ricky and Ray using. But she and her mother were terrified to report it, and so they waited until Ashley disappeared, and that was their breaking point. Police devised a plan to locate the suspects using cell phone tracking. LaToya agreed to call Ray. He didn't confess outright, but he hinted that the kidnapping plan had gone wrong, and that was enough. His phone signal was traced to Philadelphia. Even better, investigators realized Ricky and Ray had stolen Purcell's Chevy Blazer after murdering Ashley's family, and the vehicle had vanished from the scene. On January 7th, 2006, police located the Blazer parked at Ray's father's house. A SWAT team surrounded the home, and Ray surrendered immediately. Ricky tried to hide behind a water heater, attempting to conceal himself, but they were both arrested. Ray quickly confessed to murdering Ashley, Mary, and Purcell, but denied involvement in the Harvey murders, despite the overwhelming similarities. But that all changed when autopsy results came back. Ashley was wearing Catherine's wedding ring, the ring that had been missing since the fire, and that single piece of evidence tied everything together. Faced with the proof, Ray struck a deal. He confessed to everything. He described how on the morning of January 1st, he, Ricky, and Ashley were driving around looking for homes to burgle. They noticed the Harvey house because the front door was open. Ashley stayed in the car, whilst Ricky and Ray walked inside. They forced Brian, Catherine, and Ruby into the basement, and Brian was restrained first, most likely because he was the one that was capable of fighting them off, I guess. When Stella arrived home at 10 a.m, Catherine was forced to bring her downstairs, under threat that Brian and Ruby would be killed if she didn't comply. After binding and gagging the entire family, Ricky became enraged, and it should be noted that he was high on PCP at the time, which can make your behaviour extremely erratic. According to Ray, Ricky slit Catherine's throat, then the children's, then Brian's. When they didn't die immediately, he beat them repeatedly with 2 hammers that he found in the house. Ricky and Ray stole the wedding rings, a laptop, some other valuables, and even a plate of cookies that was meant for their party. Before leaving, Ricky used 2 bottles of wine as accelerants and started the fire to destroy evidence. Ricky later confessed to all murders, including Trevor's. He said he had killed his wife simply because he had grown tired of her. In total, 8 people lost their lives in just a few months. Ray received life in prison without parole, and Ricky was sentenced to death for the murders of Stella and Ruby Harvey, the 2 young children. In the years following his conviction, Ricky Gray sat on Virginia's death row, largely isolated from other inmates. By 2014, he became part of a lawsuit against the state of Virginia, arguing that death row prisoners were being held in near total isolation for up to 23 hours a day, with minimal human contact and almost no access to exercise, family visits, or shared spaces. Ricky claimed the only time he was allowed out of his cell was to cut other inmates' hair. Ironically, that lawsuit wasn't resolved until after his execution. While Ricky never lived to see the outcome, the remaining inmates ultimately won this lawsuit. The court ruled that the conditions violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment, granting future death row inmates more human interaction and access to facilities. But Ricky Gray would never benefit from that ruling. As his execution date approached, Ricky became involved in another lawsuit, this one directly related to how he would die. Ricky argued that he was never given that choice. Even more concerning, the state planned to use a new lethal injection drug combination that had never been tested before. The traditional execution drugs were no longer available, and Virginia intended to substitute them with an unproven mix. Ricky claimed he was essentially being turned into a human test subject. He feared that the drugs wouldn't work as intended, and that instead of losing consciousness quickly, he would remain aware while suffocating or experiencing severe pain. He argued that the lack of testing meant there was no way to predict how his body would respond. Given what we now know about execution protocols, his fear was not unfounded. While the lawsuit made headlines, it ultimately failed. The court ruled that the state could proceed with the execution as planned. In the days leading up to his death, Ricky announced that he had found God and said he was ready to die. On January 18th, 2017, Ricky Gray was executed by lethal injection, and he offered no final statement, so I don't know if he's ever said sorry out loud for all the things that he did. Not in a public way anyway. I mean, maybe to other inmates, but not officially. By law, an autopsy was performed afterwards, and it revealed something quite disturbing. Ricky did not die peacefully. The medical examiner determined that the cause of death was acute pulmonary edema, which means that his lungs and upper airways had filled with blood and fluid while he was still breathing, causing him to suffocate. The very outcome that Ricky feared, the slow, painful death caused by a malfunctioning or ineffective drug protocol, appeared to have happened. Years later, in January 2024, the United States carried out its first execution using nitrogen gas, a method that resulted in a prolonged, visibly distressing death that lasted over 20 minutes. That execution reignited national conversations about how unpredictable and dangerous untested execution methods can be. In hindsight, Ricky Gray's concerns were chillingly prescient, not because he deserved sympathy, but because his death underscored a grim reality. When the state experiments with untested methods, even executions can become uncontrolled and brutal. Nothing about this case feels orderly or just. 8 people were murdered in a matter of weeks, and among them 2 young children, all over greed, entitlement and violence that escalated without restraint. The Harveys had done nothing wrong. They were targeted simply because their door was unlocked. Ashley believed she was orchestrating a plan that she could control, but instead she became another victim. LaToya Pauly lived with the weight of knowing that she narrowly missed the same fate, and without her courage, the killers may never have been caught. And in the end, even the man responsible for so much suffering died in a way that mirrored the chaos he inflicted, slow, frightening, and irreversible. What remains most haunting about this case is how preventable it all was. If Stella had only come home a few hours later, she may have still been alive. If the door had been locked, the family might have been spared. And if greed hadn't escalated into rage, 8 people might still be alive. Instead, an entire family, and then another, were destroyed over a laptop, 2 rings, and a handful of cash. And that is what makes this case so deeply disturbing. It is absolutely crazy that people lost their lives over such trivial, petty possessions. They didn't even steal that much. You know, like, there was absolutely no need for anyone to lose their lives. It's so sad, especially when